For more on the death of Fidel Castro, we are now joined live by Mr. Carlos Iglesias in Havana. He is a Cuban journalist and former advisor to the Xinjiang in Havana. Welcome to our program. Cuban families have been arguing over Castro's legacy, what he has done for Cuba since he came to power. What do you make of his legacy, sir?
Well, I think his legacy will stay because it is too deep inside the hearts of Cuban people. Of course, it was a long time, and in these 6 decades, there were many hardships going on. So the support maybe is not the same as in the 60s, but still is, I believe, is very strong. And I think like that because I have seen the pictures of people in line to pay respect to his ashes today at Revolution Square.
Mr. Fidel Castro was one of the world's longest-serving leaders over the 5 decades. Many would ask the question, how did he manage to hang on to power for so long? With what kind of political power?
Well, the political power comes from his deeds. At the beginning, there were many social justice measures, just like the urban reform, the agrarian reform that benefited some poor people in the cities and the farmers in the rural areas. And there was also a big drive for improving health care services. Education was allowed for everybody. Yeah. In 1961, there was a national campaign against illiteracy, and there was also one extraordinary strong factor for his support for so many years, the hostility from the United States that gave many opportunities to show the Cuban people that their sovereignty and self-determination was jeopardized.
Mr. Iglesias,
we only have one by Robin Hood.
Mr. Iglesias, we only have 1 minute left. Let me ask you about this. Mr. Castro stepped down 2006 for health reasons. How much has changed since then in your country, and how much role do you think he has been contributing to the changes over the past 10 years?
Well, since 2006, he was out of power because of a serious illness, but still his influence was very big. I think the main changes went under his term, and now the Cuban authorities have said that they are only pursuing an update of the economic and social model. It means to continue building socialism, and they say now with prosperity, sustainability, and efficiencies.
I see.
So I think there will be no big changes in that field. As Cuban-U.S. relations is related, I think he was obviously against a process that in which he didn't trust, but still it is part of the Cuban update of the economic and social model to have good relations with that close neighbor, and that's why it is going on despite all difficulties.
To discuss more about Fidel Castro's life, I'm joined here in the Beijing studio, Yang Zhimin, a professor from the Institute of Latin American Studies at the Chinese Academy of Social Sciences. In Washington, D.C., the U.S., we are joined by Ms. Maricruz Magowan, Vice President of the National Economists Club. She's originally coming from Latin America. Well, I would like to have both of you to briefly help us understand your understanding of the legacy of Mr. Fidel Castro. Shall we go briefly with Ms. Magowan first?
Well, I think it is a very contradictory legacy. On the one hand, we have to acknowledge that Cuba has this very high literacy rate and very low infant mortality rate, which is something to praise. But on the other hand, as an economist, I have to think its economy under Fidel Castro and then his brother shrunk 50%. And people are not enjoying prosperity. This is a country that got stuck in time. One goes there and they are still, driving the cars that they were driving in 1959 in the revolution. People are risking their lives trying to come to the United States. And if they will be so happy, why should they do that? So it is a mixed feeling. As I said, he was a leader. There's no question about that. He was a very good leader because for so many years, almost 6 decades, the Castros have been in power.
I see.
Now the question is what is going to happen now?
Okay, Mr. Yang, your brief analysis.
From my opinion, I think that Fidel Castro was a great person, a great political figure, because he was the founder of the Republic of Cuba and transformed this country into a truly independent country. And he was the supporter, the builder of the social fairness and the justice. And also he was the supporter of regional cooperation in Latin America. And I think he is the supporter of the South-South cooperation. So I think he gave a legacy for the human being.
I can tell between the two of you, there are already very different opinions about how to see Mr. Fidel Castro's legacy. Cuba, certainly, as both of you mentioned, though, is now a respected player on the world stage, and that achievement is completely disproportionate to its geographical size and location. It was Castro, many believe, who truly transformed the country that has not gone unnoticed. We see that in the outpouring of condolences over the past few days since the death of Mr. Fidel Castro. UN Secretary General Ban Ki-moon said that Cuba made advances in the fields of education, literacy, and health under Castro. Chinese President Xi Jinping also called him a great figure of our time, saying that he will be remembered by history and people. Russian President Vladimir Putin sees him the symbol of an entire era in the modern history. U.S. President Barack Obama also said history will record and judge the enormous impact of this singular figure. Well, those are what the world figure have been talking about, Mr. Castro. But the question is ever more important. That is his death the bygone of a whole generation of revolutionaries? You see that in China, you see that in Cuba, you see that in Vietnam. So what would this mean to our world now? Very briefly from you, Ms. Magowan.
I think, as you said, some leaders, very important leaders, were very diplomatic. Some of them are very honest and acknowledging his presence in this world. But there are many other leaders that remain silent, and we have to ask ourselves why. That's another question. I have to give the American perspective, obviously, and in America, from an American point of view, democracy is extremely important. And that's something that from an American point of view, Cuba has been lacking. You have all of these people, even after President Obama extended his hand toward Raul Castro to reestablish relationships. And we are having, I think today, the first flight going to Cuba from American Airlines to La Habana. But even after that, there are still political prisoners. There are still the damas de blanco, the ladies in white that are being in prison, beat up,
Ms. Magowan, I understand your dissatisfaction with the realities inside Cuba from American perspective. But my question more is about, what about the bygone of this whole generation of so-called revolutionary as the leaders of countries like in China, like in Vietnam, like in Cuba? What would that mean for these countries and also for the world at large? Briefly from you, if you can.
Well, many of them, I assume, are going to try to continue the revolution. I think his brother will try to continue, but don't forget his brother is also 85 years old. So the life expectancy is not that long. The question is, who is going to come next? And what is going to be his or her, because she could be a woman, agenda.
Right.
You know, she or he could continue on Fidel Castro's and Raul Castro's agenda, or they may want to open to a more democratic process. And honestly, I don't think nobody knows at this time.
See, Mr. Yang, what do you think? The bygone of this whole generation of revolutionary as the country's leaders, what does that mean?
Yeah, I noticed so many condolences messages sent by different head of the countries or the politicians. I think the mainstream give highly praised the achievement that led by the Fidel Castro. So I think it means a finish or the end of an era, but it will begin a new era. But I think the legacy that just now mentioned were a big welfare to the wealth to the Cuban people and also to the world.
One of the interesting questions needs to be asked is how much Mr. Fidel Castro, after his retirement from the year 2006, handed over the power to his brother Raul Castro. How much role did he play in Cuba's warming relations with the United States? That has been regarded as one of the most important legacies by President Obama from the U.S. So that is a very interesting question, isn't it, Mr. Yang?
Yeah, of course. I think although Fidel Castro, I think, retired after 2008, and I think his entire retired is after 2011, and he transferred the first secretary of the Cuba Communist Party to Raul Castro. But I think Fidel Castro was still the how to say, the leader of the Cuban people, like the spiritual leader
Iconic
of the
leader,
country.
spiritual
Yes.
leader in a way.